Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Updating New Hampshire's Climate Action Plan. Today we're going to talk about the federal funding that New Hampshire received to update the Climate Action Plan, the goals of the Climate Action Plan, and how NHDES helped to go about this, and the community engagement effort that they went through and the results of the listening sessions that they had. We have with us our speaker, Kurt Youngling, started with NHDES Environmental Health Program in November 2023 in a new community engagement position. Kurt has taught earth and environmental science at community colleges in Michigan and Arizona, worked as a geologist in Alaska and New Hampshire, and worked in wetlands and stormwater compliance programs at NHDES and Maine DEP. Kurt received his BA and MS in geological sciences from SUNY Geneseo and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Before I hand it over to Kurt, I just want to mention that if you're new to our programs, I would invite you to visit our website and see what other climate programs we have. We have, if you're interested for your employees or for yourself, we have a Climate 101, workplace focused, and a climate action challenge that we invite you to visit by going to our website. Sign up for updates so you know when we're running these challenges. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here speaking with everybody and getting to know more groups around the state. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I share the right screen. If I can get a thumbs up from somebody that they're looking at the correct screen.
The right screen, yeah.
Right, thank you. So it's been a busy 6 months here at the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant team, and I wanted to just take some time to tell our story of what we've been up to, where we've been and where we're going. We've got areas in the chat and stuff for question. My intention is to kind of tell the whole story, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the end if that helps, because we'll probably start big picture and then focus in on some of the components, so we may actually answer some of your questions as we go. Okay, and just double checking that everything's advancing correctly. Are everybody seeing a timeline?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So one of the challenges we've had in the last couple of months is we've got like 3 documents with the words climate action and plan in them that we kind of live with on a daily basis. And one of them is the 2009 plan that folks might think about in the state. And many folks have been waiting 15 years to update and participate with. And then we've got deliverables to the EPA under this federal grant funding, and they have the same climate action plan named to them. And so it sometimes gets a little murky, and so hopefully today we'll straighten some of that out. And as much as I hate abbreviations, especially working in government, sometimes I find it helpful to use the abbreviations, so I'm not trying to figure out which climate action plan I might be talking about or thinking about on a particular day. So looking back on the last couple of months, I think it's probably easiest to think about the work we're doing as falling under 2 grants. And they kind of parallel each other and a similar timeline. So we've got 2 grants, 2 sets of deliverables, 1 timeline, 1 team. We got a planning grant in August of 2023, and that was from the EPA to spend the next 4 years working on a climate action plan for the state. And probably the easiest way I think to think about it is it's a 4-year grant. Halfway through, so August 2025, is the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan. That's the deliverable to EPA. As its name implies, comprehensive, it's a big thing. It's got a lot of components, and we'll cover those as we go along today. And then at the end, August of 2027, is an update to EPA, letting them know if the things that we've identified in the Climate Action Plan and implemented are starting to make a difference. So that's the way I think the easiest way to think about that planning grant. It's 4 years. Halfway through, we come up with we have 2 years to draft the climate action plan, the comprehensive plan, and then 2 years after that to see how it's going. tied into that was the opportunity to get some implementation funds to actually implement the measures that are identified in the plan. And the way things worked is that was really front loaded in this process. So even though we had 2 years to come up with a comprehensive climate action plan, we had a couple months to identify a priority plan, and then a month later to apply for grant money to actually start funding those things. Um, so again, kind of a really rapid timeline. And so while some folks may have looked at, say, a press release and seen priority climate action plan and interpreted that as what are the state's priorities, that title really is the title of the deliverable to EPA, and that was due March 1st, 2024. And the April 1st application for the implementation grants had the requirement that you had to identify the measures in the priority climate action plan, or PCAP. So our team really looked at it from that perspective, not that it was the big scale priorities related to climate in New Hampshire, but these were the types of projects and measures that we could fund if we got the money right away. And so we really looked at it as a prerequisite to applying for the grant and kind of thought of those two things hand in hand. And bigger picture stuff, things that might take longer to flesh out, they have a home in the comprehensive plan next summer. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. I really wish they had called it the preliminary climate action plan or something like that. So on the implementation grant side, April 1st, we did apply. Again, very rapid timeline. EPA anticipates letting folks know in July the awards and money flowing in October. Then we have 5 years to actually spend that money, distribute it to municipalities and businesses and nonprofits to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and related co-pollutants around the state. And then, like any grant at the end, a report on how folks are doing. So kind of two grants tied together, um, and names that are very similar to a plan that's been around since 2009. So again, our group is federally funded, and so with the federal funds come deadlines, timelines, goals, objectives, things like that. So they're coming from these funding sources. And so we've got a couple of key deliverables throughout the next couple of years. And the first two kind of talked about, we really think of them as tied together. And March 1st, identify some measures that are ready to go, talk about our current greenhouse gas emissions, where we're at, where we've been, looking at some, if we were to get these going, benefits to low income and disadvantaged communities, and then recognizing uh, DES, there's things we can do and with things we can't do, right? We can distribute money, we can enforce rules that are already in place, we can't write laws. And so it's just recognizing what we can and can't do. Um, and so then a month later, we had the implementation grant application, which was essentially getting into a little deeper about how we could make those changes happen, how the funding would flow, how much money we could handle, things like that. Next summer, we've got the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, and these are the components the EPA wants to see. And we're going to go into this a little more at the end, I think, because that's going to set the pace for how we interact with the public in the next year. So I'm going to pause on that one. And then again, at the end of any grant program, if we get it, we've got a report due of what happens, how do we do, what we learned, things like that. So one thing we needed was a team to do this. We've got, here's our core team that's been working on this. And again, we got the funding in August. So Jennifer Galbraith is our climate energy manager. You can think of her as the program manager. James Tilley and I both came on around Thanksgiving. James, I kind of think of James as mainly he's doing the bulk of the writing of these plans, and kind of taking everybody's input. It definitely is a team effort, but making it kind of come together and be one cohesive package and deliverable to the EPA. I see my job as helping inform James of what the people are saying and our stakeholders are saying, and then get the message back out of where we're at and what we could use help with, because we do want this to be New Hampshire's plan, not the four of us. And in February, we brought Brendan on board. I think of Brendan as our optimistic statement there of hiring, that we're going to have some grant money to distribute in the fall. And so we need to have somebody in place to do that. If we get our implementation grant funding, we'll find out in July when they announce it. We did build into that depending on the level of funding, we can create a couple new positions to help that money flow effectively and efficiently. So again, we're looking at the climate action plan. And so while some folks might see the 2009 plan as the template for our work, it's definitely something we refer to. It's definitely a place we start with. But in reality, the template of our work is the guidelines of these funding grants that we got from EPA. And so their objectives, their goals, their priorities, their requirements, that's what we see everything as a lens through right now. So the planning grant that we got last summer had kind of three big objectives. So tackling climate pollution, supporting good jobs, and lowering energy costs for families. Sounds a lot like a lot of the priorities we hear with the Inflation Reduction Act. Accelerate work to address environmental injustice and community-driven solutions on overburdened neighborhoods. I think of that as kind of a nod that there are neighborhoods and communities that have taken the burden of environmental challenges in the past, and maybe we can do something about that going forward. And also recognizing there's communities that may want to make their homes more efficient, decrease their emissions, but they may not have the economic setting to make all that change happen. So some external funds could definitely help out. On top of that, it's not just about greenhouse gas pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, but also the related pollutions that comes along with that, particulates and such. And so we'd love to see that a result of this work is not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also ending up with cleaner air where people live, work, and play. If we get an implementation grant, they come with their own goals. And one of the things about the implementation grants is they want to see results fast. They're not looking to fund a technology that doesn't exist and probably wouldn't be developed for 50 years. They want to see things ready to go. They want to see improvements in the 5 years of the funding. So pretty ambitious goals. So they want to see significant reductions in emissions by 2030 and beyond. Again, striving to help out, see community benefits in reducing air pollutants and help out low income and disadvantaged or LIDAC communities. Recognizing that there's other sources out there. And so if you're going to apply for a competitive grant, you don't want to ask for money where there's already a funding source. So we want to identify all the other funding sources and complement them. And then if possible, pursue innovative policies and programs that can be replicable and scaled up. So I kind of think of these as pilot programs. So if one town is ready to go but has been looking for a funding source, maybe we can help them out, and then they can be the proof of concept to have other communities say, "Hey, how'd you do that?" And so we've got success, we've got a work plan, we've got a budget that can be shared out. On top of that, also, this all falls under the Justice 40 initiative under the White House. And so a goal of 40% of the overall benefits of these investments flow to disadvantaged communities that have been marginalized, underserved, or overburdened by pollution in the past. So again, that's kind of the lens that we've been looking a lot of our work through because those were what came with the funding. Sometimes we get folks coming like, I really care about this. And we're like, we do too. But for this program, that doesn't quite fit. But along the way, we've been learning about lots of other statewide programs so we can steer folks in the other directions. So our first round of engagement efforts, we had a really aggressive engagement for about first couple months of this program. And so kind of keeping those in mind, also recognizing there are folks who've been waiting 15 years to tackle an update to the climate action plan. And so we kind of had to find a way of funneling that energy or holding it back for the appropriate time to have those discussions. So it's always nice when you're going to ask the public and the stakeholders to help you out, that you give them clear expectations. So we tried to do that. So our first round, thinking about all these requirements and goals of this federal funding that we're working with, made sense to focus on emission reduction projects, not policies. Again, we're not an agency that can make laws, and so we can definitely enforce them and enact them, but we can't make them. So we can definitely distribute funding from the federal government, though. So focus on emission reduction projects, um, near-term high priority implement ready, or as we often called shovel ready, because the EPA wants to see results quickly and wants to see the funds flow quickly and the funds be spent in that 5-year process. We wanted to talk to other state agencies and the public and stakeholders about barriers. Have you tried to do this project in the past, and what was the problem? Maybe these funds might have different rules so that we can actually make that project happen this time around. Um, Recognizing that DES is not going to be the ones that come in and install a heat pump or a solar panel or go into your attic. We're looking for partners to implement the measures. And then also, again, identifying existing funding programs so that when it comes to time for the comprehensive climate action plan, we can identify other programs that will ultimately result in decreased emissions. So that was our goal, and that's what we were asking folks to do when they came to our events and we came to their monthly meetings and they sent us emails. Because of the focus on a decent amount of these funds and benefits have to be hitting LIDAC or disadvantaged communities. We wanted to figure out how to identify those. And the thinking was, well, if you got federal funds, use federal tools and federal data sets. And when the Justice 40 initiative was rolled out, a new federal screening tool called CGEST, which is Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, was also rolled out. There's other EPA tools for looking at environmental challenges in communities, but this was the one that rolled out with the Justice 40, so it made sense, at least on a first stab, that we would go look at that tool and throw New Hampshire into it and see what the map looked like. Oops, sorry about that. And in CGEST, it goes a lot deeper than just our traditional way of thinking about a disadvantaged community. They have a lot of thresholds and a lot of different federal data sets they look at that could have a community or a census tract, because it's all based on census tract data. So your community or your census tract might get flagged on this map based on climate things that we associate often with climate change. So expected wildfires or flooding or agriculture losses, things like that. Um, then we might look at the cost of energy. I think a lot of these is thinking about either areas that already have enough of a financial burden that maybe adopting things we might think of as green energy is a burden, um, or communities that already have pollution or health related challenges. So they're already susceptible. And if we can improve the air quality, then we would see great benefits there quickly. Um, and then also workforce challenges. So if we're going to do some of this work, we need a workforce. And so do we have the workforce in that area? So this is a tool that can be used a lot of different ways. We just used it initially to see where things show up in New Hampshire, what kind of federal thresholds get crossed in New Hampshire. But if it comes back around to doing analysis and showing the benefits, this is going to be a useful tool as well. So if we throw New Hampshire into that tool, we find that we've got 25 census tracts around the state where we cross the federal thresholds. Some of them we only crossed one threshold, others we crossed 12 thresholds. Of the 31 that we looked at on the previous screen, 21 of them get crossed in New Hampshire. And I remember looking at this kind of chuckling because we don't cross the wildfire risk, which on one hand makes sense thinking about all the fires out west. We often think of California, Colorado, Arizona. But after last summer, definitely saw the impacts of the Canadian wildfires. And when we looked at the map, what we saw was in these 25 census tracts, we kind of had them clustered in 8 areas around the state. And so this seemed like an opportunity to get into the communities and actually talk to the folks that were there. And we know that they're flagged as disadvantaged on this federal tool, so they've got some challenges to making improvements. They've got some environmental challenges that we can possibly help with on these with these funds. And at the same time, the variety was spread out pretty well across the state and also give us a chance to talk to urban neighborhoods, rural neighborhoods, far north, far south, seacoast, and see the challenges that were different at each of those places. Even if transportation was flagged in a couple places, the transportation challenges and solutions in Manchester are a lot different than they might be up in Colebrook or something, for example. So, with our partners at UNH, the Carsey School of Public Policy, New Hampshire Listens, we scheduled a bunch of engagement events, and then recognizing we couldn't go everywhere, we did 6 online events, and all of this in pretty much all of this in January and February. Great time of year to drive around the state, and we'll share that with you. So for the PCAP, for that draft that was due March 1st, and thinking of all our goals in mind and trying to involve as many people and hear from as many people as we could. Um, so New Hampshire Listens, they actually got started a little early. They were working before I got hired. They actually reached out to 36 stakeholders, so kind of groups that worked statewide with things like environmental concerns, disadvantaged communities, um, industry groups, things like that, and just had some kind of sat down with representatives from those groups one on one and got ideas of who else should we be talking to, what are some of the challenges you've had in the past that we should be aware of, and try to grow our outreach and also grow our understanding of what it's like to do work in the state. We set up a designated email address that will be up for the next 4 or 5 years. So everything related to the project, if folks have questions, they don't have to remember who to talk to. They just send it all to that one site. And we got a bunch of feedback. With New Hampshire Listens, again, we had 8. We ended up with 7 in-person events in January and February. Again, we had that March 1st deadline. We did a series of online community conversations, kind of in Zoom, trying to replicate what we might do um, at an event up in Berlin or something like that. And we did 3 of those with the idea of kind of building on the process. We started with the first one being more of a brainstorming session of the types of projects and measures that could be done. And then the second one was maybe helping everybody prioritize those, kind of which ones are more important or most doable. And then the last session really focused on helping us identify barriers to doing these projects in the past and partners that we should be talking to going forward. Um, and we did similar ones where we kind of focused more on stakeholder groups than just the general public, although everybody was free to attend to whatever they wanted to. Our team also internally engaged with a lot of other state agencies that work with federal funding, work with any projects in municipalities, transportation, anything related to clean energy, green energy, anything that might relate to greenhouse gas emission reductions. Um, Anybody with experience distributing federal funds and managing grant money. And then we also met internally in DES because we've got kind of 3 main divisions: the air, waste management, and water divisions. And so everything that kind of funneled to the bubbled to the top that would should be in our PCAP that was due March 1st. We kind of put out a public notice of saying, folks, hey, this is what we've been hearing from everybody. This is what we think is doable and ready to go. This is what we think would qualify under this competitive grant program. And so we put that out there and we got comments from folks for 2 weeks. And then we had 10 days to button everything up and submit it to EPA. If you went to one of our in-person events, it was great to see it. If you haven't done anything with New Hampshire Listens, it is amazing to watch that team work. And so these were roughly hour and a half in events, and the first half hour was us introducing the program and what we were hoping to get out of the night, and then the rest of the night was them migrating around to different tables based on sector. So if you're interested in transportation issues or waste management or um, and energy efficiency, things like that. And so we had tables around different sectors, and so folks could get in there, and there was some targeted questions to kind of keep folks on task, and then all kinds of ways they could contribute. And so we had post-it notes and comments written on paper, and the awesome team at New Hampshire Listens took all of that, synthesized it down, gave us lists and what was the most popular things that people were talking about, what were their concerns, and gave us some great reports. Really couldn't have done the planning without that information. And we networked with a bunch of different facilities. And so we had events at town halls, local nonprofits, local elementary school libraries, local planning commission conference rooms. So it was a real variety of folks who were willing to host us in the communities. Like I said, we also did 6 online events, and the intent was to try and make those as similar to those in-person events as we could. And so we started out with similar. About a first third was letting folks know about the program and what we were doing and hoping to do. And then we had breakout rooms, kind of the equivalent of a little table in a conference room. And it took a lot of folks. So we had about 5 or 6 facilitators from the Hampshire Listens and about 5 or 6 folks of us from DES. And we'd go into a breakout room with a topic and a bunch of questions to spur the conversation. And then they had in Google Docs, like a virtual way of putting post-it notes up, and then a virtual way of voting on which one of those is a priority. And so we were able to get very similar feedback and information from folks, which was absolutely fantastic. And so this kind of helps you understand what was boiling to the top, what we were hearing, and again, thinking about the lens of the work we're doing and the guidelines and the goals of the programs we're functioning under. But when we looked at our greenhouse gas inventory, our current emission state, where we've been, where we're at, top 2 emitters are in transportation and buildings, especially heating and cooling of the buildings and powering them. And so we were thinking, also looking at how our emissions have been doing. And while they've been slowly going down the last 15 years, they really have pretty much flatlined in those 2 sectors. So it seemed like the story coming out of that was our 2 biggest sectors of emissions were also ones where we weren't making much progress on lowering those emissions. At the engagement events, if you just walked around, you saw that people, when they were given the option, loved to go to the transportation table, the buildings table, and the electric power table. And so after we talked with everybody, and again, we're focused on this point about projects or measures that could be funded right away, implemented right away, and show impacts right away. And that could be done by essentially throwing money at it, if you will, not by changing laws and things like that, which is outside of our scope of work and definitely outside of our timeline. So those things kept bubbling up to the top. And electric power, that's, even though folks were interested in that a lot, boy, that really delves into dealing with the grid and crossing a lot of boundaries and borders, and it's a little more regional. So again, definitely something that will be in the comprehensive plan. Um, Also, there was a lot of federal programs, as we started to learn, already there for funding solar panels and things like that. Um, so we kind of, with all that input, and we saw that transportation and residential buildings were the highest priority, where we could see the most impact on emissions and also the most impact in communities that were struggling to make improvements on their own. And the other thing we heard over and over, whether we're talking to stakeholders or the public, is if we were going to make all these changes in that 5-year period, we really need more help. We need a greater workforce of skilled trades, electricians, plumbers, um, insulate, forget the word I'm looking for, weatherization specialists, things like that. So we decided that that had to be elevated to another high priority for funding. So on March 1st, after a couple months of work and a lot of help from a lot of people, 178 pages of joy went off to the EPA and was posted on our website. And we had all the required components, our emissions past and present, and all the measures. We had measures that folks had identified as project types of projects that were ready to go and we could see happen pretty quickly. Projects that we could actually do as an agency by shepherding the funding there. And we contracted out some LIDAC benefits analysis to show that we were going to see improvements, not just statewide, but also in communities that needed the help the most. And we threw in an optional chapter just because the work with New Hampshire Listens was so great. And they had given us essentially such great reports. We thought, why don't we just add this to that? So that went out, and then no rest for the weary, because April 1st we had our implementation grant application due. So we did, like anybody does when you're applying for a competitive grant, we read the rules and tried to read the tea leaves, if you will. Um, and so the rules from EPA were anybody that wanted to apply, who could apply, who couldn't. So basically, anybody who got a planning grant, which in addition to New Hampshire, we had 48 other states, including District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, as well as 79 metropolitan statistical areas. You can kind of think of those as urban areas that might cross state lines or be concentrated in one corner of a state. So we had 120 some folks who had gotten planning grants, so they could apply. Probably EPA was thinking, if we gave you a grant to write a plan, it'd be nice if we helped you give some money to make that happen. On top of that, pretty much any state agency or office or department, any municipality, any group that might have been established under statute. So basically, anybody was eligible to apply. Um, a lot of groups, I would say, not everybody, but a lot of people. Um, Yet at the same time, the EPA was also saying, remember, we want to announce these things in April, which means, I think, in their minds, even though we have to let everybody apply, or a lot of people apply, do we want to have 10,000 grants that we have to go through by July? Um, so they kind of said what their intentions were. So they've got $4.3 billion in total funding that we're all competing for. They anticipate between 30 and 115 grants. So we read that as, on the 115 side, trying to get a grant to everybody that got a planning grant. On the 30 side, EPA really wanted folks to join coalitions and kind of affect a regional if they could. And they didn't really want to give out a lot of $10 and $100,000 grants, so the minimum they were looking at was $2 million up to $500 million. And then they gave a roughly the tiered approach of distributing those funds. So those are kind of the information that EPA was putting out there that we were trying to read. So we've got our goals. We also, in our conversations, had been talking to other state agencies, programs that are already doing things like weatherization or installing solar panels, to get an idea of, if you had more money, how many could you handle? Um, and talking to municipalities and other state agencies, how much federal funding can we manage? So all those things kind of went into the thinking, and trying to be as competitive as we could be, honestly. So we ended up taking the measures in our PCAP, and I think we funded almost all of them in these implementation grants. And so we uh, we had our own grant for most of them. We also partnered with two multi-state coalitions. The first one is looking at getting more and more heat pumps into New England, and so that was a 5-state coalition, big application, and that's going to be led by Connecticut. And then State Supporting Resilient Local Energy Coalition. I'll talk about that in a few slides. Hawaii is leading that, but we joined a bunch of states across the country in that one. And then we had our application. Some of the thinking, again, with all the stuff I've tried to already share that was going on in our minds about what's competitive, what can we handle, what can we distribute in 5 years. Um, Also looking back historically, talking to some of the folks who'd been around DES for a while, and DOT and DOE, and seen a lot of rounds of federal funding over the years. And they said, typically when there's these competitive grants, about 10% of the money ends up flowing into New England, and about 10% flows of that goes into New Hampshire. So if we're looking historically, maybe about 1% of the total budget traditionally kind of finds its way to New Hampshire. And then again, and think about how much money we could handle, the state could absorb, the projects would be done in 5 years. We kind of thought, well, 1% is 43 billion, sorry, 43 million. And then talking to other folks, that especially some programs were a little more ready to go than others. So we ended up just shy of $50 million in our application. So this slide shows you, for those who've looked at the PCAP, if you hadn't, again, we've got a bunch of sectors that the EPA likes us to function in, and then some measures or the types of projects, and then how we hope to implement them. So we're looking at EV charging infrastructure. Anybody that saw what happened with the eclipse definitely saw that showed up in the news quite a bit. Um, so there is some funding already out there for that, especially through DOT and stuff. But we learned that it's very focused on kind of the interstate corridors, and they want to fund bigger projects, so you need to have a certain number of chargers. And so one thing we often heard from towns as we went around the state was, what if we're outside those kind of high transportation corridors, or what if we want to just put a charger or two downtown and kind of dip our toes into this? So we put that into there to fund charging stations and the related infrastructure that towns might need, um, that kind of live outside the existing zones. Expanding public transit, so helping them with options, whether that's electrifying their fleets or getting more efficient buses, or getting the infrastructure they need to expand the operations. Again, we talked about heat pumps growing, and that's through the New England Heat Pump Accelerator Program. Um, Weatherization, there's a bunch of programs already doing that, but there's always a need for that. I often think about that recent report where they talk about number of homes in New Hampshire that are pre 1978, 60 some percent, if I remember correctly. And so we often think of that in terms of lead paint and lead pipes. But I often think about too is that should be giving us clues to maybe um, heating sources, energy efficiency, quality of windows, doors, insulation, things like that. Um, so weatherization programs, the other thing we noticed talking to them is that there are folks who don't qualify, not because they make too much money, but because their homes need to be fixed first. So they won't insulate a wall until the leak in the roof is fixed, which seemed like a real identification of a barrier. So the homes that needed it the most couldn't qualify. So we looked at other states like Pennsylvania and Minnesota. They actually have what they call pre-weatherization programs, where they actually will fund contractors to come and repair the homes and upgrade the homes and clean up the mold before they will do the work under the other programs. So we're looking at that one as well, and added that to the list. Resilient local energy systems. Again, we'll talk about that in a slide or two. Um, Wastewater drinking water, that one was a little interesting. It might not come up initially as thinking about necessarily a tailpipe associated with these or emissions. But what we learned going around is that for most municipalities, one of their biggest expenditures or biggest line item budget is actually wastewater and drinking water systems. And so if we can make those more energy efficient, we can see lower operating costs for the municipalities. And at the same time, most of the time, if we can reduce energy efficiency, we'll lower emissions associated with power generation. On top of that, these are often sites that folks say, hey, if we can add a solar field in town, maybe we can add it to this municipal site that's already there. Um, Recycling, composting, that's a very vocal crowd and very passionate crowd. So we wanted to do that. And we've got a group in house already at DES that works with waste reduction and waste diversion. So that seemed to be a nice partnership. And then again, what we had talked about previously, we really need to expand and improve the workforce if we're going to make all these changes happen very quickly. So we wanted to have some funds in there to help expand training opportunities, lower costs of students going through programs, help out with any financial barriers to enrolling in those programs and getting through them. So we did a lot of talking with VOTEC high schools, the state community college system, the training centers that some of the unions operate, things like that. So this is what we're looking at going forward a little bit is going to be how we're going to distribute these funds if we're lucky enough to get them. And so we had to identify at least at a high level some of the models of what we would be looking at. Um, And so some of these will flow more appropriately to nonprofits and municipalities. Some will flow to businesses that are doing this type of work. Um, some will be more of an incentive or a grant program that we might contract out competitively with a third party administrator. Some money will be distributed through things like the wastewater and the waste teams already at DES who already have partners with municipalities and operators. So that's what we're looking at, and that's one of our big things of our next round of engagement is getting targeting with the folks that do work in these different sections, and making sure that we create a competitive process in the state that's fair and efficient and easy to apply for, so that we can distribute those federal funds quickly. The Heat Pump Accelerator Program, again, Connecticut is running this, and they're looking at, I think they're still, as you imagine, to get a couple states that we're working on how that's going to look. But they envision a regional contractor that homeowners and contractors would apply to get um, funds to help adopt heat pumps. And then, sorry, the Resilient Energy Coalition. So the idea on this one was kind of interesting. The idea here was to help municipalities, maybe schools. So if you had a school, maybe a high school or a municipal building that's been thinking about putting solar panels on the roof but hasn't had the funds for it, if they could do that, then they could lower the operating costs for the community and the taxpayers. Um, and the idea was, if we can couple, say, solar panels on the roof of a building with a battery storage facility in that building, then not only do we have lower costs, operating costs for the communities, but also when we have an emergency natural disaster, there's a place that everybody in town knows that the lights are on, the heat is on, there's a battery backup to charge their cell phones, say. Um, so that one is actually led by Hawaii, and I'm still waiting for the invitation to go out to a conference there to talk about this. um, so that's an interesting one that's kind of walking the border, I think, between greenhouse gas emissions and climate resiliency. So it'll be interesting to see if and what level that one gets funded. And so that will be flowing through DES to municipalities as a competitive program. So hopefully you've got an appreciation for all the stuff that's been going on the last few months. It's been crazy, but it's been inspiring to watch the group at DES and the group at New Hampshire Listens and all the passionate people who show up to our events. So we are by no means done yet. We are kind of going into our next phase. So the next steps. So we had member said that in July we'll find out which of the 3 grants got funded and at what levels. And then we want to be ready for those funds to flow in October. So on the implementation grant side, we're looking at spending the summer getting ready to administer those funds quickly and efficiently and effectively, especially to meet those timelines and those goals of making an impact right away. So keep your eyes open. We're definitely going to have some engagement with stakeholders. So folks that work in these industries, municipalities, groups that advocate for folks. But we basically want to come up with the best RFP, request for funding proposals, that we can, so that when we have our competitive process in the fall, folks understand how to apply, what can and can't be funded, things like that. And they'll probably have probably looking at a series of steps to get to those final things. Not promising anybody that they will get the funds, but recognizing that there are folks out there who have applied for funding in the past, have dealt with some of the challenges. And so if we can make our application process as efficient and understandable as possible, and recognizing that maybe we need to have some technical assistance to help folks apply, um, and also waiting a little bit, not only to see what EPA says they are going to fund, but also are there any other rules we should know about, like things have to be made in this country, are there certain level of pay, things like that. So are there other constraints that are going to come with this funding? And then we are already working on the comprehensive climate action plan that's due next summer. And so we're definitely going to be engaging with folks. That'll probably be more sector by sector. So folks really passionate about improvements in transportation or buildings or wastewater or waste management. Um, and so what we're roughly thinking right now is those will be kind of some work groups that folks can join up in and be part of the drafting of this document that will turn into EPA next summer, and sharing drafts along the way and trying to be as transparent as possible. And along the way, also identifying, even if we do get funding for the implementation grant work, there could be there's definitely going to be future measures that we identify through this process. And so if we can find funding that already exists for them, it's a much better chance of reaching the goals. So wrapping things up here. So again, kind of coming back around, we've got these two documents with the word climate action plan in them. That first one that I call preliminary, but EPA called priority. And so that really was, where are you at, what's ready to go right now, if you had some funding. And then the more comprehensive plan. And it's much more detailed and goes a little bit further. So you can think about it, if we expand on the PCAP, we're looking at not just what are our emissions like and where have they been, but where are we going? Where do we want to be? What are some targets? How could we get there if we adopt this, if we adopt that? So some modeling that goes into place as well. More measures. Like we had said, we were really focused on shovel-ready projects, making as big an impact as possible to make our application for implementation grant funding as competitive as possible. But there are plenty of other measures that will reduce emissions and co-pollutants. And so we want to have a much more encompassing list of measures. And also recognizing some of these measures as a state agency can implement, and some of them we cannot. And so recognizing, maybe giving folks an idea of next steps that could come along afterwards, that it's going to take more work to get things like laws and things enacted. We can't do that on our own. We're going to take our benefits analysis and expand it out to the whole state, and then also do another set of analyses for all the measures in the CCAP. Expand on our workforce planning. We basically identified a bunch of workforce needs, but if we're going to expand out to planning for 2030 and 2050, having some plans in place. And maybe this is where things like identifying challenges with licensure and things like that, that maybe that kind of stuff comes into place, not just trying to get more students into these systems. But we're going to have folks helping us out along the way on all of these. And then again, whether or not we get implementation grant funding, and no matter how much we get, we're going to be identifying more and more measures over the way, and hopefully identifying more and more state and federal partners that have programs that still could get to the goals of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is our small and mighty team. Appreciate everybody inviting us here to give you an update. And if you want to know more, we've got our own website. New Hampshire Listens has their own website. There's some QR codes that take you right to those websites. And if you know anybody that couldn't come today, we are doing a very similar program with New Hampshire's Listens help Wednesday evening at 5:30 and Thursday at noon.
Thank you, Kurt. We have a few questions already. Knowing that transportation is actually the biggest sector that you identified, there's a huge opportunity to reduce emissions in transportation. We're the only state in New England that does not offer any incentives for purchasers of EVs, emission-free vehicles. Any chance that purchaser incentives for fossil fuel-free transportation will be part of this plan?
I definitely think that could be identified as a measure, and it was one of the things we heard early on. I think in our timeline, figuring out how to do that, and it was quite honestly probably something that was way beyond what our team could do with our authority, and whether it would be funds flowing to directly to consumers, directly to dealers. I think there was just so many things to be figured out, that so I can definitely see that being in the comprehensive climate action plan as identifying something that would definitely make a difference. I think it just at the time there was just too many moving parts to make that part of the application.
You did identify setting up the EV infrastructure, which is something, again, we're identified as behind on.
Mm-hmm.
With the infrastructure applications, you said that nonprofits or agencies or communities can apply. Can businesses apply to be centers for charging stations, to install charging stations for the community and in a collaboration and their employees.
I don't think there's anything that we've written that says that can't happen right now. And I think this is what that summer engagement is going to be, is really kind of hammering out how those funds can flow. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Because one of the things we often heard too was, one of the challenges of a lot of these changes is multi-family housing, right? Who's the owner versus who's the customer of the power company. So it's a similar one. So that's definitely was brought up. It's definitely part of it. I'd have to go back to the team and double check exactly what we're looking at. But I think part of the engagement, especially for that group, if folks are going to would like to be a part of that, definitely keep in touch with us and get on our mailing list, and we'll include that in that. So definitely.
And so another question, do you have any insight about, and this is like you said, reading the tea leaves, about the range of funding that is probable? You mentioned 1%, 50 million is historically realistic. What are, basically, what's your feeling here? What are the odds?
We're all trying to be hopeful. We wouldn't be doing this work if we weren't. I think I might have heard through the rumor mill that EPA got about 40 billion in applications. And so whether they decide to give everybody 10% of what they asked for, or they actually do identify places where it can make more of an impact, I honestly don't know. As we often hear as I go around, that we're behind. If somebody would recognize that, and maybe we deserve a little more to help get caught up. I don't know, honestly. So, EPA they're not posting the application, so we can't see how ours compared to others or anything like that. So we're just crossing our fingers through July. And then also, next year there's a lot of changes happening, and so I don't know if there'll be other funding sources and things like that, or different priorities for the state. So yeah, it's a lot of unknowns right now. So
It was surprising not to see zero carbon electricity renewables in the PCAP. Do you expect the CCAP to address the electrical sector or the energy sector?
yeah, and definitely, like I said, we're going to have chapters focused on all the sectors, yeah, and I know folks were frustrated. I heard some frustration from folks, and hopefully now they understand the process a little bit better. It was, if we leave the word priority off the climate action plan, it really was list projects so you can apply for them April 1st. That's really all we had the bandwidth to do, and that's what we were focused on. So we had all kinds of comments that came in, and those right now James is going through all of our New Hampshire listens notes and all of the emails, and so he's going to start. His goal is that when we have our engagement sessions and these work groups, that he's going to start with, here's the list of everything we've heard so far, and help us figure out to include them all, put them in order, things like that. So nothing has been thrown out. I want to make sure folks know that. If they didn't see it in the PCAP, it was really, if it wasn't in the PCAP, it's still in place for the CCAP. And so it was just really going with that EPA guidance. Circle back around. So there is some things for, there are places for it. Like I said, putting more solar panels or renewable energy at wastewater treatment facilities, or that resilient building. So there is money in there to go towards zero emission power sources on a local scale. I think also, I just think with the timeline and our bandwidth, and also what we heard about barriers from other folks, tackling the challenges of the grid and the infrastructure and how energy is distributed in the region and stuff was something that just takes some more time to really flesh out a plan. And so it belonged better in the CCAP, I think, in folks' minds. Not that it wasn't a priority at all. It was just, again, could it be funding? If we have to see regulatory changes or laws changed, that's not something we can throw money at in November. And so that's why we were looking at the PCAP and the implementation grants coupled together.
So there's a question about, can you go over the timeline of the RFPs again? Will those be collected before you get the final funding amount or after?
So part of it is, how much work can you do until you get the implementation grant, which funds some of the positions working on the RFPs, right? So it's kind of that walking that line. But my understanding from being the fly on the wall and some things is that we would be looking at the summer would be focused on developing that RFP process with a lot of input from folks who have done RFPs on the not on the state side, but also on the applicant side. I think the team's goals would be that if we got the announcement, then we can really kick that planning process into high gear because we know that there's money coming. And then the idea, but I don't think we could issue the RFPs until the funding was awarded in October and accepted by the state. So I think that would make, and also that would just be the polite thing to do, right? Not have people applying for money when we're not even sure if we'll have it or how, so I think it would make sense that the goals would be to have that RFP process rolled out very quickly after the awards are received from EPA in the fall.
Okay. There was a comment about the social determinants of health and how when you put the CGEST map, it was talking about all the social factors that implement health outcomes. And you did mention that in part of the review, you have to provide measures of the success of your projects. Do these measures just include greenhouse gas reduction, improving air quality, or are you also tracking health outcomes and other things in the measures that you put for the outcomes of your plan?
I think for the EPA requirements, I think they're very focused on the co-pollutant reduction because I think that's probably just the easiest thing to measure, right? We can measure particulate decreases and stuff, and then we can make the connection that if we can do this, then we can see increases. And I think also this is just me trying to kind of think about how this is related. We might not see the public health benefits in this short window of this grant, but we might be able to say, hey, when we submit a report in 10 years, we'll also be able to look at whether those have gone down. So I see them as definitely related. I think the EPA guidelines is mainly about looking at those co-pollutants as showing immediate impacts of these projects. But definitely the justification of all this that has to come into play in my mind. But so we'll have to see. And the EPA is constantly giving out more and more guidance and having sessions and updates about how to do some of this stuff. And we had been working on it a few months when templates finally came out. So I envision we'll get some more guidance along the way. Um, so definitely related. I think anybody can see that.
Yeah. So
Exactly where that analysis will fit in the final CCAP, I'm not quite sure, quite honestly. Whether it's just a narrative of co-benefits or data, or maybe it's something more like that we include in the wrap-ups in 2027, 2029.
for those individuals in the audience and businesses, last question, advice, how to prepare themselves for what's coming once you have, how do they get ready to benefit from this right away?
Great, thank you. So definitely, like I said, we're going to be doing engagement. We're going to have looks like we're going to hopefully have some work groups focused sector by sector, and they would be folks working probably fall into spring, and we're still working exactly how we would coordinate all that and what they would look like. But we want to be this as inclusive and as transparent as possible, um, and definitely for the folks that think they might apply for these funds or who have experience applying for state and federal funds and competitive process, we would love to have them be part of the engagement we do over the summer about really getting these RFPs there. So um, I think the first step in that would be an RFI, request for information, that would go out, and that would probably go out early in the summer, and that would be more of just a, hey, let us know, you know, um, in New York, for example, if we were going to say help fund somebody installing something on their house, in your experience, is a 50% incentive good enough, or did nobody apply until we cross 90? Those are the kind of things we don't know, and so it'd be silly to design a program. And so that's where the experience of the folks who do this and have done this in the past really would help out making this process go. If they say, hey, unless you fund 100% of the work, nobody's going to apply for this. Okay, good to know. Uh, and so those kind of things. So that's where I see that's the process I see over the summer. And so one of the things we are doing right now is we're next month or two, hopefully really revamping our website so it becomes not just a one page kind of about the program, but actually here's what we're working on. Here's how you could submit stuff. Um, so we have the CPRG email address. Any questions related to that, send them to us. We might not be able to answer things right away, but they are being read. They are being saved. That's the other reason we have one email address. So, and also just we're building a big list of people who want to be involved with us and what they're associated with. So um, but kind of pay attention to that, and definitely if we're going to start those, I know sending it to your group and your folks to help distribute. um, what I saw a lot in our engagement initially was the environmental um, groups that were really passionate about things, um, and the which is I love to see that passion. But I think definitely in some ways they're talking to the wrong branch of government to get some of the change they want. And I think what we'd like to hear definitely more of, especially as we start getting into this implementation, is the business side, the municipalities, the folks that would be doing this work and applying for it. Not just, hey, we should have a grant program, but what's a grant program that a busy contractor would actually apply for and wouldn't look at it and go, that's too hard. I'm not going to bother, or I won't pass along this possibility to one of my clients. Um, so I definitely think that's where the business community and the trades, we really are going to lean heavily on them over the summer throughout this process of developing. Does that help out?
Yep. Yeah, that's very
All I
helpful.
see is your face nodding. So
Thank you. We,
you're the
we went,
avatar for the group.
we went 2 minutes over, but thank you for those who stuck around, and you'll have the recording, the slides, and the resources that Kurt provided sent to you tomorrow with the follow-up email. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Kurt, very much for the update. And we'll continue to watch out for more updates from NHDES as this process continues. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Fingers crossed.
Thank you.